members to day 2 and webinar 3 of the All Energy Decarbonised Virtual Summit. It's the 21st webinar we've held since May. There are over 540 gathered in our virtual audience for the path to net zero and COP26. Obviously, there's a long haul to net zero, but as we learned yesterday, we're moving in the right direction. We've got to get to work at size and scale and really start moving the dial now. On the subject of now, we are, of course, a year away from COP26 at All Energy's home at the SEC in Glasgow. We have a great panel straining at the leash to get explaining how they see both paths advancing and their recommendations, hopes and expectations. I'd like to thank Scottish Power and the Scottish Government for sponsoring what I know will be a thought-provoking 90 minutes. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of our duo of shows and co-creator of All Energy way back at the start of the century. It's time for some housekeeping points. Whilst I talk briefly, my slide will help you get the greatest benefit possible during your time with us today and afterwards. It is important that if you would like to ask questions or rate this webinar, you shrink your screen from full screen to be able to see where to do both things. And if you opt for attachments, you can see all 8 of the webinars being held during this virtual summit. Yesterday's are already available on demand viewing, as this webinar will be later today. We've 4 splendid panelists this morning. Our chair, Keith Anderson, CEO of Scottish Power, Chris Stark, CEO of the CCC, Professor Rebecca Willis, all featured in our very first webinar back in May, just after Becky's book, Too Hot to Handle, had been published, and we welcome Mike Barry to the fold. I'd like to particularly thank Keith Anderson, who chaired yesterday's superb opening session, and today here he is again. You're a glutton, not for punishment, but for the fun of spreading the word, Keith, and thank you for your video promoting this session. Your enthusiasm should be bottled and sold. This session is particularly relevant to him, for he's one of the COP26 business leaders who have clear climate ambition plans about accelerating the race to zero across sectors and supply chains. We look forward to hearing more about how you and your peers will drive things onwards, Keith, and thank you as ever for your support. Without more ado, I'd like to wish all of you here today and your families good health in these worrying times, and now pass over to Keith and his equally passionate speakers for what I know will be a memorable 90 minutes. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Judith, as always, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here. I know yesterday was a really, really good day at the conference and some great sessions, and we had a good debate, kick-off debate at the opening session as well. So hopefully everyone will enjoy this session as much. I think as Judith said, I think there's over 500, well over 500 people have joined, which is fantastic. We've got some great speakers lined up for you, which again I think is a real tribute to Judith and to the team. Said this to Judith, I say it every year, this is to me the best energy conference in the UK during the whole year, and that's a huge tribute, and really down to the hard work and energy that Judith puts into this every year. So thank you again, Judith, and thank you very much for asking me to take part in some of the sessions as well. I say we've got a great panel, and I'll let them listen you shortly, and we'll introduce each of them to you. And again, as Judith said, during this, it's great. These sessions are at their best when people ask questions, and we can have a bit of a discussion and a debate after each of the panelists has spoken. So please log your questions, and we'll try and cover off as many of them as we can before the end of the session. Okay, so the UK, as we all know, I think the UK is committed to a net zero target of 2050. Scotland 2045, And we all know that reaching that target is a big challenge, and it requires huge change across the economy. But I think the critical thing is that we've got a lot of the foundations have been put in place to allow us to deliver it. And like anything, if you invest enough time and put enough effort into getting the foundations right, it should make everything else easier and everything else possible. And I think that's where we are, certainly as a country and as an economy. The energy sector has been a huge part of putting some of those foundations in. We've invested as a sector significantly already in renewable generation and in the network infrastructure that requires to be there to allow the transition, not just for the rest of the energy sector, but for the rest of the economy as we try and open up the pathway to decarbonise transport and heat as well. All of that investment is absolutely critical that we've done up front, and it becomes critical to allow the UK to get to its net zero. COP26 is a truly pivotal moment. It will galvanise a huge amount of action and a huge amount of support. It will create a massive amount of public awareness. It will bring the eyes of the world on the UK and on Glasgow, and that becomes partly a challenge. But I think more importantly than that, it's a colossal opportunity for us in the UK to show what we've done, what we can do, and to show the leadership and the ambition that we want to drive forward for this country and for others to get involved across the rest of the world. As a business leader, a COP business leader, and as a company, we're absolutely committed to playing our part to ensuring that COP26 is a massive success, and that it's used again as another springboard to push us and encourage us to drive forward to that net zero ambition. We'll spend the next hour and a half hearing from some fantastic speakers about how we would chart that path to net zero, about the hopes and the aspirations for COP26. We've got joining us today Chris Stark, who's the CEO of the Committee on Climate Change. As I kind of jokingly said to Chris earlier, I've become horribly, and you'll understand this comment when you see him, I've become horribly familiar with Chris's bedroom over the last 6 months as he does some of these presentations. But Chris is always fantastic to have on a panel, and I'm sure he'll give a lot of thought-provoking comments. We've got the brilliant Professor Rebecca Willis, who's the Professor in Practice at Lancaster Environmental Centre and an expert lead on the Climate Assembly UK. And again, having heard Rebecca many times talking and presenting, I know again she's going to bring forward a lot of great points and hopefully lots of challenges and thought-provoking stuff as well that'll help you think about questions and engage in the debate. And then we're also joined by Mike Berry, who's a sustainable change maker and a former director of sustainable business at Marks and Spencer. So Mike will bring with him a huge amount of expertise and knowledge about sustainability, about the pathway to net zero, but he's also got a great business perspective and having worked with Marks and Spencer's and a company that's looking at how it takes its part in driving the country towards COP26. So lots of great stuff lined up for you. Before I let those brilliant people listen you, you're going to have to put up with a few words from me, and I'll just make a few opening points and a few opening remarks about my view on where we are on the pathway to COP and what we're doing as an organisation. So, it's over a year since the UK took that leadership position in legislating for net zero, which was a brilliant step forward. But obviously a lot has changed in that time, not least of all, we're still in the midst of a COVID crisis and a pandemic, and that's changed an awful lot about who we are, what we do, how we live, how we work, how we travel. In the past 8 months, in many respects, have turned everything on their head in terms of what we used to take for granted and what we understood to be normal, personal practice and normal business practice. However, all the way through that, the one thing that's not changed is the fight against climate change and the need to make sure we continue to work towards getting to net zero, because we still see the impacts of climate change every day across the world, and those threats and those challenges have not gone away. There's an ever-pressing need to change and get people to change direction, to reset, to change the path we're all on, to make sure that actually we can reverse and stop the irreversible damage from happening that we know will happen unless we take that action. But it is also worth reflecting and recognising how far we've come, because a lot has been done as I say, and a lot of foundations have been put in place. And we don't want to lose sight of those things, because we should use those good things we've done to encourage us to do more and encourage others to get involved. If you cast your mind back to May 2019, and that was the time of the last All Energy Conference when we were all together in person, and we announced as a company the partnership between Scottish Power, the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council to get Glasgow to be the first net zero city in the UK. And that triggered a kind of competition between various other cities, all trying to get involved in that race to net zero. And it's great, again, to see that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of commitment to wanting to make this happen. Just after that conference in May, the UK put in place the legislation for 2050, which was a colossal step forward. Scotland then stepped up and put in place its targets for 2045 and the procedures to get to net zero by 2045. And as I say, since then, lots of towns and cities have come forward with net zero ambitions, commitments and targets, and are putting in place plans to help drive them forward, which is, again, brilliant to see and absolutely critical for us to be able to achieve this as a country. That momentum has started, and it's just not going to go away. I think the momentum is now built in to everybody's mindset in terms of business, in terms of the public, in terms of stakeholders, and in terms of wanting to get towards those zero carbon communities all across the UK. We also had the great news that COP26, although it's been delayed, that COP26 is going to go ahead, and it's going to go ahead in Glasgow. And again, that's just brilliant for the whole of the UK, but obviously particularly fantastic for my home city of Glasgow as well. And in the midst of the pandemic, we've got countries and economies all over the world who are now in agreement that an economic recovery is required to get us out of the pandemic, and that economic recovery has to be a green recovery. So it has to be absolutely about infrastructure, it has to be about creating jobs, but it's about doing it in a way that builds back a better, stronger, more sustainable economy. And again, I think that, despite all of the problems of the pandemic, it has created that fantastic opportunity to have a reset and have a different way of doing things and a different way of thinking about the future of what we do as a country and how we work. We're seeing climate change and the rewards of investing in green technologies through the mainstream political debate. There's a groundswell of public opinion for faster progress in terms of cleaning up the environment and decarbonising the economy as well. And there's a clear agreement that this green recovery has to be a priority, and that we need to make sure it's done in the right way, but we also need to make sure it's done fairly and it's done in a just way, that no community and no groups of people feel left behind or they feel excluded. We need to bring everybody with us to make this a success and to make it possible. There's a long way to go, and there's a long way and a lot of stuff we need to do between now and COP26 in terms of focusing our minds, but we have that target, and I think that's a great thing. We can work together now to put the plan in place as to how we accelerate progress to net zero and how we achieve a green recovery between now and COP26. As an energy company, as a utility, we believe we've got a really positive and pivotal role in delivering the response to COVID and delivering the green recovery. We're not a bystander. We're not going to sit and watch others take part in this. We're already investing in infrastructure. We've invested in renewables and in storage and in networks, and all of that is a critical part of the foundation to get us to net zero. We are, as an industry and as a company, the first port of call about making homes greener and helping individuals make their contribution towards net zero as well, whether that's through energy efficiency, smart meters, EV charge points, heat pumps, etc. It's all critical and all really, really important. And then obviously we've got our experience of what we've done in the power sector in terms of bringing forward renewable generation, whether it's onshore wind, offshore wind or solar, and all of that experience we can deploy to start the process of decarbonising transport and heat and industrial processes as well. And I think it's obvious, it's very, very clear now as well to everyone that we can't do these one after the other. We need to move on transport, heat and industrial processes from now and start that transition and put a huge amount of investment into it. And again, I think there's a lot of great signs if you look at what's happened over the last 6 months in the conversation about hydrogen and a hydrogen economy, which looks like it will play a critical part in the future of decarbonisation, particularly for industrial processes and helping to decarbonise industrial processes, as well as potentially helping with some difficult transport solutions as well. As part of our commitment to green recovery, back in June at Scottish Power, we came up with a 10-point plan called Unlocking Net Zero. And what we wanted to do was to bring forward a really detailed plan of hard, physical, real, implementable actions in the short term, in the next 2 to 3 years, that actually kick-started and drove us towards the green recovery, that created jobs and that started to build projects in and across the transport sector, the heat sector, as well as continuing to drive forward in renewables. The green recovery is a huge undertaking. It's a big leap for us to make in many ways, but it's certainly not a leap into the dark. We know what we need to do and we know what we're trying to achieve. And whether that's investment in networks, investment in renewables, or getting ready for transport and heat, we all know what we need to do and we all know how we can deliver it. And by and large, we can get on with it really without a great deal of need to call on money from the government or from the public purse. And I think that is a great start point as well. An awful lot of what we can deliver through the continued expansion of renewables, through transport, through heat, and even through decarbonising industrial processes can be delivered through private capital and investment if we get the right mechanisms and the right balance of regulatory processes and competitive processes, get those put in place to give investor confidence and investor certainty, then we'll see that drive take place and we'll see that investment come through the market. The challenge for the UK is to make sure all of the processes that we need to deliver are in place. It's great to have a high level ambition, but it's absolutely critical that all the processes that underlie that ambition and make that ambition possible to realise that they're also aligned and put in place as well. I think it was fantastic to hear the Prime Minister make his announcement about offshore wind, about the 40 gigawatts, about having every home powered in the whole of the UK by offshore wind by 2030. Some people thought these are kind of big, really difficult targets to set, that maybe they're a bit unrealistic, but that's exactly what we need. We need big, ambitious political goals, because that's what will drive the investment, and that's what will drive the enthusiasm, and that's what will drive the industry forward. And again, what I would say is, in doing all of that, we've shown as a sector and we've shown as an industry that we can achieve those kind of targets. But there's big challenges in terms of transport and in terms of heat and in terms of that infrastructure, and we need to make sure we get that shifted and we get that moving really, really quickly as well. Some of the studies I've looked at and have been published shows that we need maybe 20 to 25 million charge points across the whole of the UK. We might need to be installing 20 million heat pumps across the whole of the UK. And if we started that today, that would mean us installing about 5,000 of those every day from now until 2050. Now, on the one hand, that shows you how big the challenge is, but on the other hand, it shows you the size and scale of the opportunity, both in terms of investment, but also critically in terms of creating jobs and creating training opportunities, and critically in terms of spreading the benefit right across the whole of the country into every community, every town, every village, not just big cities and not just big financial centres. We can create jobs and opportunities right across the whole of the UK, and that's critical in getting everybody bought into the COP26, everybody bought into net zero, and it's also critical to making sure everybody feels like this is fair and everybody's getting their role to play and a part to play in the future. COP26 should be at the forefront of everyone's mind. When we look ahead to next year, we need to be making sure that we're getting in place all the plans for our future. We've provided that we're able to create a successful, we're able to create a successful offshore wind market. Again, if you look back 10 years, no one dreamt we'd be where we are today in terms of what we've achieved with offshore wind, in terms of the size, the scale of it, the innovation that's come through it, the way we've brought down the prices, the growth of the sector, and all of the targets that were set for the industry, that were set for the sector, they've been annihilated. We've blown them completely out of the water. And again, it shows you if we get this right, if we plan it properly, we put in place the right mechanisms and processes, we can absolutely deliver against all of these targets and deliver all of the ambitions we have. Offshore wind, as everybody knows, is now one of the cheapest forms of generation. We've established a global industry, and again, there's huge benefits that come with that in terms of supply chain jobs, manufacturing and training opportunities. And the UK can absolutely, quite rightly, claim leadership in terms of making all of that happen, not just in the UK, but leadership across the whole of the world and driving that offshore sector and all of the opportunities it brings us. But we can't stop where we are now, and we can't stop and rest on those successes. To be a world leader in the transition for electric transport, and a world leader in terms of the transition to low carbon heating, we need to keep driving forward with innovation. We need to keep bringing forward new technologies and new solutions, and we need to keep bringing forward the investment and the marketplaces to let this happen. The world's watching, without a doubt, and the world will really, really be watching the closer we get to COP. So we need to use the time we've got between now and the COP really, really wisely to show what we have done and what we can do in the future. We need to make sure we get the plan put in place, we create the right market mechanisms, and we create what would be a truly, truly ambitious and brilliant and successful COP26. Okay, look, that's enough from me. As I say, we've got fantastic speakers lined up, and we're going to hand over to the first of those. We're going to hand over to Chris, who says you'll all know Chris, the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. And I'm sure, as always, Chris is going to say some things that inspire us, that challenge us, and that show us the size of the opportunity and the size of the prize. So Chris, it's over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. I'll do my best to do those things. Pleased to say a few words this morning. I'll admit I'm a bit bleary-eyed after last night. I made the mistake of staying up late and then getting up early. So I hope I can string some thoughts together that are at least coherent. So, I mean, let's just start, shall we? I mean, let's say here we are. We are 12 months from a delayed COP26. We have still no election result from the US to reflect on. And as you say, Keith, I'm still stuck here in my bedroom in Glasgow. This is not the situation that I would wish to be in. I don't want to dress it up. But what I'd like to try and do this morning is cut through the gloom a bit and try and look out beyond the US election and indeed the pandemic and offer you my genuinely optimistic view of where we're heading. So here's my take on what we should be watching out for in the run-up to COP. First, let's talk about global momentum. So we have the election uncertainty in the US, and the sad news is that today the US formally left the Paris Accord, but the EU, China, they've made historic commitments to net zero this year. We now have the Asian states. We've got South Korea and Japan. These were among the last to pursue a coal strategy, now signed up to a net zero goal. If the US comes back into the Paris Accord, if Biden comes in with that net zero commitment that he's promised, then we will be in a situation where something on the order of 2/3 of global GDP is under that mid-century net zero goal. Let's just pause on that. That's quite a thing to be able to say to you this morning. That is what we foretold last May when we gave our advice to the UK and the Scottish governments to set net zero targets in law. We said then, go early, give confidence to other developed economies to do the same thing. France went next, then we had the EU, now the Asian economies. That is real progress. We might question why that's happening. I've got a couple of thoughts on that. I think firstly, we are experiencing climate change now. We are all understanding throughout the world that it is a real thing that is with us today. It's no longer an issue of tomorrow. The extreme weather events that we are seeing now happen around the world, the forest fires, the tropical storms, the heat waves, torrential rain, flooding, they are indeed happening. People experience it, understand it, and they understand that those events are happening more frequently and with greater severity, and that is climate change. And people want action. We used to think of those things as long tail events, but actually they're much more likely now thanks to the climate change that we've seen so far. I think there is a palpable feeling of the need to act on climate change now, which we're seeing picked up now in these kind of net zero commitments. And the second thing is that the club of countries pursuing decarbonisation is also a trading bloc. So it's something to be part of, not something to dismiss. I very much doubt that China's interest in net zero is philanthropic. This is I think a guiding economic signal for all countries in this century. it is essential that every economy develops, produces, designs the goods and services that will guide the global economy to net zero by the second half of this century. And if you're not in that club, then you have to question whether your economy is heading in the right direction. So I think those are the kind of fundamental drivers. And I think if this comes together, as I hope it will, by Glasgow next year, then COP starts to look more like a celebration of progress. You can see that in those national commitments to decarbonisation that I've talked about already. That is an amazing thing to be able to say to you. I certainly wasn't saying that 12 months ago with any real conviction. So let's just think about that global transition first. So that global momentum is my first point. Second, talking about net zero, it is now a practical goal. It happens to be the law of the land, of course, in the UK and in Scotland. It happens to be also a scientific imperative globally. And it's the point when we stop warming the planet. But much more important than that, it's also now just straightforwardly a realistic goal. I think there is belief that it will happen. We will achieve net zero by hook or by crook. So the only question, for me at least, is whether we here in the UK surf that global wave towards net zero, or whether we let that wave engulf us. There are a handful of global trends, and it really is just a handful of global trends that are going to drive progress towards net zero globally. So it's closing coal, it's growing cheap low carbon power alongside that. It's the pace we're about to see, I think, in the adoption of electric vehicles. I think that is going to be really one of the amazing trends to watch over the next few months, never mind years. Hydrogen as an energy carrier, decarbonising industry, carbon capture too, decarbonised heat and cooling as well for buildings. And let's not forget the nature-based solutions. We need a lot of trees to be planted over the coming years. These are the trends globally that are going to drive our progress towards the Paris Accord, towards net zero. And there are now practical strategies to implement change in those things. And those global trends are something that are going to make the headlines, I hope, in Glasgow next year. That's where the big corporate commitments to net zero can really drive progress alongside the national commitments. And I hope we see the coverage of that being, I hope that is one of the big themes of Glasgow next year. At the basis of those global trends is still clean electricity. And that is something that we now think has a cost advantage over fossil generation. So the economics of decarbonisation get better and better and better each year. That is inexorable. And it's so exciting to be able to say that. And the benefits, of course, go beyond carbon alone. We're talking about energy independence for nations, better energy security, energy efficiency and fuel savings, improved air quality in cities, all the new employment opportunities that come with that investment. So in many instances, the cost of decarbonising is now negative. So that transition from petrol and diesel cars and vans, we think, is going to be cheaper than sticking with those outdated technologies now, underpinned, of course, by the dramatic falls in the price of renewable energy for the consumer. So I think we should feel comforted that we are now on the way. There are real costs, of course, to be met to get to net zero throughout the world, but those are mainly investment costs. That's capital expenditure. So it's investment that over the next few years can really be the basis of the global recovery from COVID, or global stimulus that can be really pitched around those things. That is very exciting. So that's the second of my observation. And the third is coming back home. I'm afraid it's my solemn duty to highlight to you the need for a domestic plan for net zero here in Scotland, where I'm speaking to you from today, and across the UK. We do not have that plan right now, just as you said, Keith. We are promised one from ministers in Westminster and in Holyrood, but so far those are, I'm afraid, just warm words. We in Scotland and in the UK are the hosts of this jamboree next year, and it is a role that we will only be able to fulfil properly if we have a credible domestic plan for reaching net zero. So the action really needs to begin quickly, and for me it will begin in December. December is 5 years from the Paris Agreement, on the 12th of December actually, to be specific. That's the date when I hope the UK will step out and demonstrate that it really means business by naming its 2030 commitment to cutting emissions. So the NDC, as it is known. I think you're going to see a lot of coverage of that over the coming weeks. And I want to say something about our role here in the CCC on that, just in my closing comments. We're going to offer our recommendation on the UK's NDC on the 9th of December. So that's the date that we will publish what I hope will be the most important report that the CCC has ever produced. Building on the work that we did last year in net zero, we're going to be plotting a course for the UK and Scotland to get all the way to net zero in our advice on the UK's 6th carbon budget. So that's the target for UK emissions in the mid-2030s. And it's on that basis that we'll be offering advice on the UK's NDC for 2030. And I just want to take a moment finally to talk about that report that we'll be producing in December. Last year, as many of you I hope will know, we brought you advice on reaching net zero in the UK. We painted a picture of what we would need to have achieved by mid-century to reach net zero across the UK, 2045 for Scotland. That was about the end state, if you like. It was a sort of proof of concept, really, that it was possible to reach net zero. This year, the conditions are different. We've made that law. So it's my ambition that the CCC now describe in detail how we can achieve that over the next 20 to 30 years. So you can expect from us in December a much clearer blueprint about those things. So how investment needs to scale up across the economy, the steps that can be implemented in practice to decarbonise every sector, the costs, the benefits of that investment. We're going to be able to say how that's all going to play out with actually quite a lot of certainty in some of these issues. The policies, the steps that are going to drive that, also advice on how to do that in a fair way, just as you quite rightly referenced in your opening comments, Keith. That is one of the most important conditions of success here. And happily, I can tell you that work is really coming together nicely. So it's going to be a tremendously exciting thing that we can publish for you in December. And, you know, the costs, it will not surprise you, Keith, but I'm sure it will surprise others who don't follow it so closely. We think the costs have fallen for achieving net zero, even since the assessment we made last year. We have a much better handle on the many benefits of acting on net zero, you know, including energy efficiency, resource efficiency more generally, also health improvements, really important dynamic here. And a few things I can tell you about that transition already. It's big. We're talking about more than doubling the size of the electricity system, building a hydrogen sector that's probably 10 times the size of the thing that we have today, decarbonising 30 million buildings, 40 million vehicles, fully decarbonising UK industry, all those nature-based solutions that we talked about earlier. It's increasingly clear what needs to be done in most areas, and that's what's exciting about it. We understand the technologies and the strategies that we need to deploy to cut out fossil fuels and to cut greenhouse gas emissions. They are all perfectly feasible. So we will be able to lay out for the first time the dates by which we need to start phasing out fossil fuels so we achieve that transition on time. That is something to watch for in December. And those dates are surprisingly close. I would encourage you all to try and think the way we've been thinking about it in terms of cycles of asset replacement. Your average car is going to be on the road for 14 years. Your average boiler is in use for 18 years. We will need to reach a point in the early 2030s where every investment, so every heating installation, every car, every piece of plant and machinery, every new home even, is zero carbon. Think about that. So this is the decade ahead of us, when plans will be made for that, when the policies will be set, when the investment plans are going to be drawn up. Those plans and strategies are going to have maximum impact if they're committed to in the next 12 months before COP. And here we do need to talk about COVID, because the great reconstruction after this period is going to be an opportunity to use those net zero investments as the means to rebuild the UK and the Scottish economy after this COVID crisis. And that's true in the economies around the world too. And that, in my closing comment, is the challenge I see for the UK as the COP president. It's not just to host a good summit in what I think is the best wee city in the world, in Glasgow, but it's to ensure that in the year before it, that governments around the world are stimulating their economies to grow in a green way on the path to net zero. That's the diplomatic mission for the UK as president of the COP, also president of the G7. And back home, I just want to finish by talking about the industrial dividend that I believe there should be for acting in all of this. I would love to see Scotland and the UK grab some of those global trends I talked about earlier and lead some of them. They are each, you know, diamond-encrusted economic opportunities, something we can say safely that the rest of the world is going to need. And the advantage of our ambition on climate really should be to try and develop economic opportunity from going early in those things. So, Prime Minister, First Minister, we are going to need to see those plans for net zero, something that we can then show others around the world, something that we think can be invested in with confidence. And that is genuine climate leadership. And I suppose my final point is to say I'm confident it can be done. There is time to do it, but it's such a critical year. So with that, back to you, Keith.
Chris, thank you. As always, that's fantastic, brilliant. some real good things in there in terms of challenges, in terms of opportunities, in terms of the importance of this, and also it's a lot of stuff in there which is really interesting about the timeline and when things start to become critical. And I think when you put it in the perspective of by the time you get to 2030, that every boiler replacement has to be a green one, every car replacement has to be a green one, and it does show you just how critical time is. It's very easy to fall into a sort of false sense of security about 2050 being a long time away, but it's not, given those replacement cycles. So brilliant. Thank you as always. And now we're going to hand over to Rebecca Willis, and I'm sure Rebecca is going to enlighten us as well and bring forward a lot of really good opportunities and also challenges. So Rebecca, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. And like Chris, I'm a little bleary-eyed. I kept waking up to see what was happening in Florida, but I will go with the spirit and stay with his evidence-based optimism, because the National Citizens Assembly on Climate was the best thing to have happened in 2020. And, admittedly, that's a low bar, but I'm going to stick with that. So I want to shift the focus of the conversation a little bit away from technology and onto people, because I think this is absolutely crucial to achieving our net zero ambitions. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about people who I got to be part of as an expert alongside Chris and others. So firstly, Mark lives in the northeast of England, and his grandfather was a miner. One of the defining moments of Mark's childhood was when his grandfather lost his job when the pits closed in the 1980s, and he had no work and no plan. Nothing was provided for his grandfather. Will just basically find work elsewhere. This was a really significant moment for Mark, and nearly 30 years later he got an invitation to join Climate Assembly UK, and climate change wasn't something that he'd spent much time thinking about, but he decided to take part, and he brought that experience with him, and something that he and many other Assembly fairness. This concept of, what we as policy watchers might call just transition. They didn't use these words, but the idea that the net zero transition has to work for communities like Mark's was absolutely front of mind. Mark himself has his own business fitting gas meters, and as a result of Climate Assembly UK, he with the training, so that his next job is fitting heat pumps. So that's Mark. And then another real character who took part, and both Mark and Sue are featured on some little videos, which I can give you the links to. But Sue from the West Country was a fishmonger and a keen rugby player. And when she got the letter inviting her from she thought it was a hoax, because she said, why don't one from Parliament be writing to me? But she did reply, and she did take part, and she describes how when in our final weekend in person in the Birmingham hotel, she met up in the bar with some of her fellow participants who she hadn't known before this process, and the conversation got to them thinking about how they as individuals would take forward the learning that they'd had in the process, and how they themselves would follow up this commitment to net zero that the Assembly was talking about. And following her involvement, Sue saw a vacancy for the local parish council, and so she's become a parish councillor. She's involved in the democratic process. So the reason I tell you these stories is that I think they illustrate that climate change is above all a deeply social issue and not just a technological issue. And this insight is often missing, but I think it needs to be front and centre of net zero strategies. When Judith asked me to take only all-energy session back in April or May, I think it was. The focus of what I said then was to emphasise that expertise, the kind of expertise that that we have as a panel, that most of I imagine our audience here has, that expertise is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient to achieving net zero. If you live in a democracy, experts quite rightly don't get the final. We should remember that, suitably humbled by the fact that the people get to decide this thing. So we have to get politicians who feel comfortable championing this agenda, not just going along with it, but absolutely championing it, willing to make a case and to show leadership. Historically, and I've done research on this, politicians have felt very nervous about speaking out. Sort of zealot or overly sort of radical on climate. That might be changing. It absolutely needs to change. And you've got to craft climate solutions that resonate with people, essentially that they'll support and vote for. So that's absolutely the point of Climate Assembly UK. And just to recap, if you haven't read about the findings, and I'd strongly encourage you to, Climate Assembly UK was commissioned by Parliament. It brought to represent the UK as a whole. They were essentially a sort of mini version of the UK. And when I walked into that room and saw my country represented in front of me in the form of these people, it's quite a breathtaking moment. So they're representative in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, where they live, their socioeconomic background, and their attitude to climate change. So the participants met be 3 weekends in Birmingham and then 3 online sessions. And there were 3 phases. So firstly, they heard evidence from experts, and they had the chance to question those experts. The second phase in a deliberative process is the deliberation, where they think things through, question experts, talk to each other, learn more, and discuss and develop recommendations back to Parliament. So that's how it worked. I'd strongly suggest you look at the report. There's loads of detail across all the areas needed for decarbonisation: travel, air travel, energy use in the home, so essentially net zero heating and energy efficiency, land use, food farming, electricity generation, carbon removal, and all some recommendations on COVID recovery and net zero, and a really strong message from the Climate Assembly that they absolutely wanted COVID recovery to be aligned with net zero, and the converse as well, that they didn't want to see COVID recovery strategies which might jeopardise the net zero goal. So when Climate Assembly all that for the sort of eye-catching recommendations, so banning cars from city centres, banning gas boilers, that sort of thing. But for me, the underlying principles that the Assembly members drew up and that absolutely run through the report like a stick of rock, those underlying principles are much more important. Like that principle of fairness that Mark really championed, this idea that it absolutely has to be fair, have relied in the past, still rely now on jobs that have a high carbon price. Another underlying principle, that of information, education, engagement, and that's something that you heard from Sue's story, and this idea that you won't get to net zero without people noticing. You absolutely have to engage part of the assembly process, to have the access to the dialogue, to the expertise, and to be able to understand net zero. And they were really surprised actually that given the significance and what they now knew about climate change, they were really surprised that debate wasn't more front and centre of politics, or our everyday conversation media, and they absolutely thought that was it was not only important but also necessary in order to gain support for the measures. And another underlying principle was government leadership and consistency, preferably cross-party, which I found really interesting. So I think these strategy for net zero as the decision about essentially which technology will get us there. So I'm going to leave you with essentially three things that being involved in Climate Assembly has taught me, and they're things that we might want to come back to in the discussion. Firstly, I think that when we've thought about the role of people, there's been a tendency to think of people as consumers, not as citizens. I think that's wrong. And there has also been a tendency to phrase this in terms of what will people accept or what will consumers accept. And I think that's the wrong question. The question should actually be, under what conditions will people support a net zero strategy? And it's about those conditions of fairness, of engaging and informing people. Those are the sorts of conditions that will allow us to have a popular net zero strategy. And I've been thinking of this increasingly as a social contract between citizen and state. So the social contract is the oldest political idea there is, more or less. It's this idea that as individuals, we are willing to give up some of our freedom, some of our autonomy, in order for to provide for us collectively those safeties, those public goods that we can't manage for ourselves. That social contract is absolutely fundamental to politics, and I would also say it's fundamental to achieving net zero. What is that deal between state and citizen around meeting? So that's the first point. We're asking the wrong question. Secondly, a really important theme that came out through all the Assembly discussions was the need for locally specific strategies. Again, coming back to Mark and the devastation that deindustrialisation brought to the northeast, we can't afford to have that happen for net zero. Was the need for much more finely tuned to local situations, local industry, employment, local communities. And that's quite a change, definitely, from energy policy, which has tended to be very sort of national, rolled out from the national level, one size fits all. But I think coal, I am just north of Lancaster in Cumbria, in the county which has just consented for the third time the first deep coal mine in the UK for more than 30 years. Local councillors voted overwhelmingly in favour of that mine because of the jobs that it brought. So they chose dirty jobs over no jobs at all. And, I've been working hard to make the case against the mine, but I have to say that those local politicians and local communities have been let down by a national strategy which is not specific enough to be able to say this is the low carbon future for West Cumbria. You don't need these jobs. And at the moment, there isn't much else on the table for West Cumbria, or so the politicians think. We absolutely have to get that right. We have to get that local specificity right if we're going to do this. And thirdly, when it comes to debating particular policies, it's absolutely so, whether that be decarbonisation of transport, whether that be the challenges of home heating and cooling, not just does technology reduce carbon, but also does this policy, does this technology build engagement? Does it actually help to build a stronger mandate for net zero? Because we absolutely need that strong mandate. And an interesting thing to consider is what some political scientists call symbolic policies. Those policies which do a job, but also tell a wider story about the kind of world that systemic example of a policy actually was Mrs. Thatcher's decision to allow people to buy council houses, because it said it wasn't just about housing. It said so much about the kind of society that she wanted, and that she said people wanted to live in. So what are our symbolic policies for climate change? Are they those much more local, community-centred policies, or are they a sort of big national communicate about the kind of society that we want to live in, the kind of net zero politics that we want to have? So I'd be really interested in your views on that. I know I'm handing over to Mike now, who has incredible insights from his time into how the net zero challenge is understood and taken up by individuals, at least as consumers of views on that, and yours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Look, thank you so much, Rebecca. Again, some great points raised there, and some fantastic summaries there in terms of I thought those the last 3 points about the consumer versus citizen, the whole idea of a social contract. Thought the whole bit about levelling up the economy, and then also those kind of use of symbolic policies in terms of what message are we trying to get out there. Fantastic stuff. I think, look, it's great. Moving on to our last speaker now, Mike. Mike, again, I think if you pick up the same mantle, and I'm sure you will deliver as many relevant challenges and opportunities as both Chris and Rebecca have done. So really looking forward to hearing from you as well. So over to you, Mike.
Keith, thank you very much. And the great pleasure of coming last is that I can riff off some fantastic comments from Keith, Chris and Becky. I'm going to make sort of 10 very, very brief observations now, just to sort of generate the discussion that we need going forward, and very much framed from a business perspective. So the first thing is I want everybody in business to recognise that we're coming to the end of a very settled 40-year cycle of capitalism. 1980 to 2020, we've had neoliberal globalisation in return for low taxes, low regulations and access to capital and job markets across the globe. Business delivered rising consumption, rising employment and rising GDP growth. Now, as we've seen with the rise of populism, as we've seen with the COVID, and now we've seen with the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, etc., that 40-year cycle is coming to a crunching end, and a new form of capitalism is being recreated very, very quickly. So COP26 in 12 months' time is going to be right at the wellspring, the heart of a new form of capitalism forming. And most business leaders don't recognise that. They just think that the next few years are a creeping incremental version of what's been in the past. Forget that. The second thing I want to pick up on very briefly is what Becky just said about citizens. Citizens consume, they invest, they vote, they bring up families, they're neighbours. Our understanding of what motivates them, not just in the UK but globally, is pathetic. As Becky's just said, the Climate Assembly has been a brilliant lifting of the lid as to what really motivates people and drives them forward. We need to go to COP26 with a much better understanding of why people will participate in the revolution that we need going forward. The third thing then takes me absolutely to something that Chris and Becky picked out, the just transition. We have to take human beings with them. So much of the problems we've got with politics now is that Washington, London, Paris feel very, very different from the hinterlands of most nation states. If we believe that we can sort the climate crisis out from a couple of technocratic wonks sat in a policy block, somewhere shiny block down in London or Washington or Brussels, forget it. This has to be a conversation we have with all. I've heard from Keith talking about 25 billion heat pumps, 25 million charging points. We've heard about 30 million homes from Chris that need to be retrofitted. I would have a Marshall Plan that makes every home in Britain a low carbon home quickly and create jobs off the back of it. That's what we need. We need urgency, we need pace, we need to make this real to people in terms of benefit. The fourth thing has been the power of government. Now, most sectors in the UK economy, whether they like it or not, have been relatively lightly regulated over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Government is now stepping in with a net zero 2050 commitment enshrined in legislation that says this is no longer about a small number of businesses putting their hand up and voluntarily stepping forward to take climate action. The whole economy needs to participate. And again, I would say many of my fellow business leaders have not woken up to this. They still think it's about the Unilevers stepping forward and taking the weight and carrying things forward. This is about the entire economy changing going forward. Now, what we still need from government, price on carbon. If there is one thing that would drive it, fundamentally shift the UK and global economy, is a decent price on carbon. Ratcheting it up that penalises the bad guys, celebrates the people who bring low carbon solutions to the marketplace. That's what we need. It's the key to the door. I'd also pick out the Global Resource Initiative, the GRI. It's brought together policymakers, civil society and business to co-create the policy framework of the future to eradicate global deforestation for the supply chains that bring products into our marketplace in the UK. We need more things like that. The fifth thing I'm going to mention ever so briefly is investors. They've been utterly absent in terms of the sustainable debate for the last 10, 20 years. The last 12 months, they've moved like an express train. Still a long way from where they need to be. But I love things like the Climate Action 100 Group, $47 trillion of assets under management between them, putting pressure on the 161 biggest greenhouse gas emitters across the planet. Science-based targets, net zeros, get on with it. That's brilliant. We need more of that. However, as Share Action's shown us, looking at the 75 biggest asset managers on the planet, graded them A to E, over half of them got a D or E ranking in terms of their approach to sustainability. So there is still a long way to go. But bringing that investor voice into Glasgow drives the corporate response, incredibly important. Sixth thing, scope 1 and 2. Lots of work being done to decarbonise operations and things that businesses physically own, shops, lorries, offices, warehouses. But the true battleground is scope 3. We're just waking up to that now. And again, I worked for a relatively small retailer, shifting 3 billion items to 32 million customers every year from thousands of factories, tens of thousands of farms, thousands of raw material sources. That's where the true carbon footprint of Marks and Spencer on many businesses lies, supply chains and consumer use of those products. We have to put scope 1, 2 and 3 at the very heart of what we do. And consumption's key to this. Before we hit COVID, the world was consuming 130 billion pieces of clothing a year. Now, whether we spring back to that post-COVID, we'll see. But it's a staggering amount of consumption. Dear friends at Coca-Cola who actually work very hard on sustainability, serving 700 billion servings of Coca-Cola around the world every year. It is about how we consume stuff, is how we solve scope 3. 7-point partnership. Again, so many businesses have tried to get some nice press release, a nice award and nice wins from just acting alone. Nobody can tackle the systemic issues that face the economy alone. We have to organise the sectors. I've seen the Consumer Goods Forum do it around deforestation from palm oil and soy. I'm seeing the British Retail Consortium do it now, preparing for COP26 with an ambitious set of targets across the entire retail sales sector to work together on carbon. We've seen it from the UK water industry, National Farmers Union, the world's concrete and cement associations. No sector should be around in 12 months' time without a common decarbonisation plan for its sector and all its members. Takes me to point number 8, transparency. Transparency drives behaviour change. So whether it's NatWest committing to sort of surface the scope 3 footprint of its lending portfolio in terms of carbon, the business benchmark on farm animal welfare, or carbon labelling from Quorn, from Upfield, from Allbirds, all that is good and useful. But we need more legislation, more push to surface disclosure from every business, not just a few that do it voluntarily. Penultimate point. Tech for good. I've grown up in a world where pen, paper and spreadsheet was being used to try and track 3 billion items across thousands of locations on the planet and improve their human rights footprint, water footprint, carbon footprint. Bloody well. It's impossible. It can't be done. Now we've got digital revolution. We use technology for good. And the big tech giants, the Microsofts, the Apples, the Googles are stepping forward with solutions that we all need. AI, big data, that can be used for tremendous harm, but can be used for tremendous good to solve the problems we've got as well. Tech for good, we need to understand it better and put it at the heart of COP26. And my final point, I want every business leader to understand that this is not about 3% energy reduction each year going forward, creeping incrementals, and this is about fundamental marketplace disruption. We've seen the shift from coal to wind plus battery. We've seen the shift from diesel car to electric car. We've seen the shift from meat-based diet to plant-based diet, the shift from throwaway fashion to resale platforms. Wherever we look, carbon and sustainability being put at what business models actually offer the consumer. So what we've got to do is fundamentally have a different mindset as business leaders to say, if I sit on the sidelines, I'm not going to get a punch from Greenpeace once a year or a bad front page from The Guardian. I will be out of the marketplace if I miss this shift. So let me leave it there. We need scale. We need shift in scope from 1 and 2 to scope 1, 2 and 3. We need a different way of working. We need to shift from working alone through in partnership. We need to embrace radically new tools to drive the scale and the pace that we need. And above all, we need a different mindset, a shift from incrementalism to disruption, and one that puts people, human beings, at the heart of a low carbon future. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. Some fantastic points there again about that relationship between business and consumer, about the need for leadership, the whole issue of just not relying on keeping incremental targets, and also the power and the influence that the digital and technology can have in helping us drive forward and drive towards those targets. So look, you've had 3 fantastic presentations. Thank you to all of you for listening in, but more importantly for all the questions. Again, I think the quality of the speakers is shown by the massive number of questions that we've had in already for this session. We're going to try and get through a number of them. There's no way we'll get through them all. I've tried to group some of them together, but hopefully we'll have we're going to have a good debate now and an opportunity to go through a number of these issues. So the one I was going to kick off with, and there's a few people come in on this, and I was thinking about this as well, and it was it kind of raised its head in some of the stuff that Rebecca had covered off about the social contract issue. And I suppose the question for all of you, and I'll maybe start with Chris, and we'll come to Rebecca at the end, is given all of the changes the government have had to implement in terms of rules and telling people what to do and telling people how to behave during this pandemic, do you think that makes the idea of a social contract and getting people to shift and change behaviours, do you think that makes it easier for the government? Or do you think actually on the back of the pandemic there would be more pushback to those kind of rules and instructions from a government? So what's your view, Chris, on whether the pandemic helps or hinders that kind of social contract?
I don't think I can answer that. I mean, I think there's a good argument to say that it has opened pathways to do things more quickly than we had prior to the pandemic. There's another argument that says actually that people are, after this period, going to be less likely and more reluctant to respond to those kind of strong directions from government. I think underneath it, there's a more interesting question, if I may, still on the pandemic, which is that I think we've all had this experience during the pandemic, which I'm certainly not dressing up as being a positive one, but we have had our eyes open to a different kind of way of life, I suppose. We've come to appreciate our communities a bit more. Green spaces, particularly in towns and cities, very, very kind of important things that I think we'd forgotten about for a while. Local high streets, different outlooks on how to work. I mean, it still stuns me that I can sit and do this kind of thing from my home in Glasgow now in a way that just was not possible prior to the pandemic. So I think that for me is the more interesting dynamic. What potential is opened up by those experiences to move more quickly on things than we thought prior to the pandemic. It's possible that we'll have a more coercive government that's willing to make kind of big statements. And actually, if you're interested at all in this field, it's worth listening to the speech that the Prime Minister made to the Conservative Party conference, which I have to say didn't have an enormous amount of content in it, except on net zero and on energy. So I'm just kind of interesting that I think I don't really regard him as thinking of climate as a theme running through things, but I do think the energy transition is something he's grabbed as being a theme that he wishes to his government to really push on. And I think that's because it's tied to the levelling up agenda, as Boris would call it. So I think he's going to be, my take on it is he's more willing to make those kind of coercive statements on a topic where he feels it's safe to do that. And energy, it looks like an area where he really does want to make those kind of big investments and statements. I'm less clear that he's going to be keen to step in and try to change lifestyles and behaviours so clearly. I mean, I could be wrong on that, but I don't know if the pandemic has taught us too much about that. I suppose my final point is let's try and learn the positive stuff that we have, that we can at least take from the experience we've had over the last 8 months, and what looks like it's going to be longer than 8 months, doesn't it, sadly? But that might point a way to an even sharper course correction on UK emissions after this, Keith.
There you go. Thank you, Chris. And there you go. A headline, a Prime Minister's speech that lacks content. That's a newsflash, is it?
Exactly.
I'm sure we'll we'll see that quote from you in the paper tomorrow. There you go. Mike, kind of building on that then, not to answer exactly the same question, but if we're building that, which and some of the points Chris raised in there about the changes that have had to be made, do you a real opportunity for business to embed some of those changes that they've had to implement? They've been painful and been tough, but do you think it offers businesses a way to reset and a new start?
To an extent. I mean, if you look at the sort of the very tactical things that have come out of COVID for business, the work from home rather than from working in a big shiny office, I think clearly there's going to be implications for the built work environment and for mobility commuting in terms of that. I personally would be very cautious about looking for great centralized mandates. I think everything we've been saying that this needs to feel more democratic, more grassroots, owned by communities, done by people because they believe it's the right thing to do. And that's why I very much want to bring the business voice into this. Business has spent the last 40 years through neoliberal globalization being really good at getting people to buy things perhaps they didn't realize they needed, but getting them to do it nonetheless. So I think business, through the innovation of shifting from a diesel car to an electric car, they actually want to drive because it's high performance, it's desirable, it's aspirational. Shifting to a plant-based diet, not because you're told to do it, but because it's fantastic, it's tasty, it's healthier. Why wouldn't you want to do it? I'm much more of a fan of that. I think where I want to see strong government interventions, things like a price on carbon, that forces business to come out of the trenches and start doing the things we've just spoken about. But trying to get 65 million people in Britain march to a low carbon tune that's decided in Holyrood or is decided in Westminster, I'm not sure that's the right way forward.
Okay, fine. And Rebecca, just on that whole issue of the pandemic and the way it's changed government behaviour and potentially the behaviour of populations in terms of instruction, if you ran that back through the climate assemblies, how do you think people are change their view, or do you think it would change their view in terms of what the government needs to do around climate change?
Yeah, I mean, we asked the Assembly this specifically, and they were very comfortable about the government aligning its COVID recovery strategy toward net zero, and we're quite comfortable with what many might think of as a pretty interventionist economic policy. And it's interesting actually that I think one of the things COVID has done is made intervention perfectly normal on the left and the right. But intervention versus laissez-faire is not really the right axis to be thinking about. I think actually what COVID has shown us, I mean, us as policy specialists, if you like, but also what has shown to people more widely, is that this is a debate about shaping markets and shaping society. And, what COVID has demonstrated is the immense importance of the state in shaping markets and shaping society. So it's not about, the extent or level of coercion or intervention, but it's actually how, there's a much more explicit discussion of the role of the state in that, as I say, in left and right. And, what I wonder is whether it might, and I don't think this is decided yet, but whether it might shine a bit more of a light on the fact that debate is central to climate, both in terms of, you cannot privatise handling climate impacts, right? I mean, especially if you want, if you don't, if you want that climate impacts is to buy your own island or go to the moon, which some people are working on. You can't privatise climate impacts, but you also need a very confident political strategy to lead us to net zero. And I think that a lot is up in the air now because of COVID. So I'm relatively optimistic that we are thinking in
Okay, sorry, I kind of lost just the very, very end of that, Rebecca. Apologies, so it's maybe my connection. But look, thank you for the answers to that. Let's change tact just a little bit. And maybe quite a lot of questions coming in about technology and the advancement of technology, you know, in and around hydrogen, and what's the real answer about the hydrogen economy? Is it a utopian hope that's just unrealistic, or is it part of the answer and part of the deliverable, and maybe part of the stepping stone towards that, and linked to that is the whole issue around carbon capture and storage. So again, you know, maybe just I'll start with Chris. Just your view on, you know, are they critical? Are they a part of the transition, or are they a kind of political dream?
So I mean, I think hydrogen and carbon capture each have a really important role to play in getting to net zero. I think the question is not so much whether we have them, but the degree to which we have them. So I mean, that's my starting position on it. I mean, it's important to say that I don't think that hydrogen is the kind of the silver bullet or the answer in and of itself. But it's a really, really good complement to what should really be the central strategy of electrifying the economy and using, you know, green electricity production as the basis of the whole energy system. That electrified economy doesn't answer all of the problems. So, you know, there are some pretty important and unanswered questions about, I would say, three things really. One is what you do with industry emissions, especially where industry energy rather, so especially where you need high temperature processes, and hydrogen potentially offers an answer there. Another question is what you do about backup power, and especially flexible backup power, and potentially hydrogen offers us a kind of decarbonized solution there for where we presently use natural gas in the power system. And the third big area is in transport. So it's unlikely now, I think, in my view at least, that for light transport, for cars and vans, that hydrogen is going to be the lead technology. But for heavy goods, for long distance travel, and especially for shipping in its ammonia form, then hydrogen offers a really important route through to a decarbonized energy system in the future. What's clear in all of those worlds, whether I'm right or wrong about those things, is that we are going to need more hydrogen than we have at present, and that the supply of that hydrogen has to be decarbonized. So, you know, from my perspective, that's something we really need to get started, even though we don't know precisely how we'll be using it over the next 20, 30 years. You know, this is not the first time we've faced uncertainty like that, but it is a journey we're going to have to begin. And coming back to the question of carbon capture, we like carbon capture in the Committee on Climate Change, not because we like fossil fuels, but because having the ability to do carbon capture opens up the possibilities and the options to do other things. And again, it's a sensible thing to start on. So you can imagine a world in the UK, at least, where we've got maybe a handful of places up and down the country where we're doing carbon capture, where we're doing industry, where we're doing hydrogen production. We can start on that now. We can envisage the kind of policies that would kick that off, and the kind of policies that would ultimately bring in the commercial investment to do that carbon capture and that hydrogen. If down the line we find that green hydrogen and electrolysis is the right thing to do, and because the power price is so cheap, it's an efficient and an economic thing to do, then so be it. You know, we've started that process and we have the ability to supply that hydrogen and to use it. But unless we start this journey, we've got this chicken and egg problem with hydrogen that we're not going to crack in time. So I would like all of these options to be on the table, but the basis of it is something I know that you agree, Keith, that it really needs to be an electrification strategy for this economy, because that's how you get the kind of efficiencies and fuel savings that will make net zero actually a very cheap endeavour overall.
And thanks, Chris. And Mike, maybe from a business perspective, do you think there is there's a reticence for business to invest in making the switch to SNOW, because they want to understand that long-term answer. They want to understand, actually, am I about to do the right thing, or am I about to invest in something that in 10 years from now we'll find out was the wrong answer? And that kind of no regrets, slight sort of conservatism that maybe runs through UK investment, UK industry. What's your view on that?
So just two quick thoughts, Keith. I mean, the first, let me just pick out heavy goods vehicles. So we can see a pathway now, albeit 10, 20, 30 years, to decarbonise light goods vehicles and the car that we all use. Heavy goods vehicles, there's virtually no movement whatsoever to find a solution. And typically, businesses are buying fleets every 5 to 7 years. So decisions made now are locking heavy carbon solutions in there. Now, heavy goods vehicles cut right across the economy. The retail sector uses them. Every productive sector uses them to shift things around. Government needs to be convening a group, or somebody needs to be convening a group that brings all those vehicle manufacturers, fuel manufacturers and the people that use the lorries together rapidly to develop a solution and a pathway forward where we say it's electric, it's biomethane, or it's hydrogen, but we need to get on with it. So that's the first thought. The second thought, when we talk about hydrogen as a technology, I would frame it slightly differently. Hydrogen is a system. It's a different way of bringing together multiple clusters of manufacture that we're not used to doing in Britain, certainly not the last 20, 30 years. And this is where we need a bit more of an interventionist government. We need an industrial strategy, and there's been attempts of them over the last 2-3 years, but I'm not sure they've stuck yet, that says we will create these hydrogen clusters to create the feedstocks that a small number of productive sectors need. They can cluster around that. Now, that's partly about individual technologies. That's partly about mindset and organising the economy in a different way as well.
Thanks. And then maybe just a slight tweak to that question, Rebecca. You know, when you're looking at the climate assemblies and you know, the whole concept of citizens and getting citizens bought in and engaged in this, you know, do you think the average citizen cares less whether it's electricity, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's an EV, whether it's a hydrogen-powered train or a bus, etc., or do they just want to know, here's the answer and here's how you move towards it?
Okay, so I mean, there's really clear research on this, both from the Climate Assembly and previous work, and tend to depend on the sort of nuts and bolts of that technology in and of itself, right? I mean, that is significant, but it's not the only picture. People want to know, you know, who controls that, who owns that technology, who controls it, who benefits from it, what does it mean for me? That's the kinds of things that they want to know, right? So, and that came across, for example, in Climate Assembly UK. The carbon removal technologies, and the explicit reason that the Assembly gave for concern about that was that it would that it might distract from the job of carbon reduction. That, you know, if carbon removals, and it is an if carbon removals are seen as a sort of get out of jail free card, which we do see actually. I mean, look at, you know, the absurd concept of a net zero hydrocarbon basin that the Scottish Government is claiming. We do see that, and people are alive to that, and they worry that you know, if the technologies aren't properly managed, that they might be seen, you know, that they might actually not serve the right purpose. So I think about the governance of the net zero target and the need to have very clear and transparent governance processes in place at local and national level, precisely to tackle these sorts of issues, and particularly to make sure that vested interests are not abusing the system.
Thank you. And Rebecca, one point you raised there, which it links to another question as well that's come up, you know, the whole thing about the implementation and the targets and the delivery. And Chris, I'll maybe flip this back to you. You know, so one of the questions that came through and comments that came through was, you know, from the perspective of, you know, we've got a 2050 target and people talk about what we need to do by 2030 and what we need to do by 2040. Those are all kind of massive, big 10-year milestones. Do we, you know, how do we move from that to something that's much more about annually or every couple of years, here's what we need to have done, here's what we need to have achieved? You know, is it realistic to expect from a government, you know, and from the political process that we're going to get targets broken down much more than that?
So, I mean, my own view, and this is a personal view, is that actually it doesn't help us to have those kind of annual targets, because when they're missed, it just undermines the framework. I think decadal targets, you know, I can absolutely see the merit in that. And the work I mentioned in my opening comments, is the UK carbon budgets are set 15 years out. So, you know, this idea that you've got a kind of a thing to achieve over the next 10 to 15 years, and it's the job of the government to get cracking on that is I think a good basis for national progress, at least underpinned by the statutory framework. The interesting thing for me, Keith, is that we have really, until today, it's all been a phony war. So we've been talking about a thing that genuinely is in the future until now. So, we are at a point now where it is actually this Parliament and the next one where those plans need to be drawn up. And we need to get to that point. And that 2030 date is important. It's because that by that point or thereabouts, it's earlier for some sectors, it's later for some others. But by that point, we need to have got to the point where we've put all the plans in place, all the policies in place. The industry has responded in the right way. We're at the point where every new purchase, every new investment is zero carbon from that point onwards. That is a massive challenge over the next decade. But that's how you get to net zero by 2050, because I just make the point I made earlier. It's really important to think not just about those carbon pricing mechanisms that Mike referred to, because they are important. They're the good backdrop to this, to the progress that we need to make. But to think more tangibly about replacing those assets. It's really an investment challenge to get to net zero across the economy. It's an investment challenge for business. It's an investment challenge for citizens and consumers too. So we've got to get to the point where we match those kind of capital replacement cycles, the boiler in your house, the car outside your house, so that we don't get to a point where we need to scrap lots of assets in the future, because that's costly, it's very unwieldy, and frankly, it's unlikely that we'll do that. We're not going to get to a point where you're going to be paying people to scrap perfectly useful assets at that point. So we've got to act early on this. There's no great secret that that's the case, but it's now upon us. So the implication of the net zero target is really that in the next 5 years, we've got to have a proper coherent strategy, and then we've got to let that flow through to the point where we get to that point at the turn of the end of this decade, where people are now buying the things that will dramatically cut emissions across the economy. And that's how you get there. That's the secret sauce. So, the challenge is not really a future one anymore.
Perfect. Look, no, thank you. That's a great answer. Mike, then, about maybe just building on that then again, Jan, from a kind of business investor perspective, is we have that ambition, we have the big target, we have the strategy. Do you think business believes that the right building blocks are in there then to deliver, in terms of, you hear people question, actually, is our planning system up to delivering this? Is our regulatory system up to delivering this? Are the right frameworks and mechanisms in place to get the investor confidence and the buy-in to delivering this? Do you think there's we're getting there, or do you think there's lots more needing done there as well?
I think there's lots more still to be done. I think Chris and the team have done a fantastic job. And whenever I'm talking globally about the UK's contribution to tackling the climate crisis, I talk about the Climate Change Act, the Committee on Climate Change, the 5-year carbon budgets. Beyond that, it is then imperative upon government to put in place the long-term carbon policies that business can invest again. Within reason, in terms of offshore wind, it's being done well. In terms of retrofit of domestic homes, it's been done badly. So whenever government has shown business that long-term certainty, it's responded to it positively. But I think to Chris's point, very eloquently made just now, we don't have a roadmap ahead of us. And I don't define what Chris and the team have done a brilliant job of coming up with the budgets. I don't define that as the detailed roadmap that is not within the control of Chris and the team. It's in the control of politicians who now have 12 months in the COP26 to show the roadmap by which a big, complex Western economy can decarbonise rapidly in a way that is beneficial to society and the economy as well. And if we think we've got that today, we're sadly mistaken. And that's not just by sector. These points about transparency and carbon, price and carbon that I'm talking about that underpin it all. So I think we've got a huge amount still to be done.
All right, no, big challenge, a big challenge. Okay, and moving on then, Jan, Rebecca, I'll ask you to come in on this, and just from your own perspective, but also a perspective of what you think from the assemblies as well. The oil and gas sector, and my beloved friends in the oil and gas sector, and I think occasionally they get berated and they get criticised. We've heard lots over the last 6-9 months from BP, from the likes of BP and Shell and others, about what they're doing, how they're changing, how they're buying into this. Where do you think we are in that process in terms of, and how do you think we keep pushing? Do we berate them? Do we encourage them? Do we get them bought into it? How do we make sure we get that transition? Because without a doubt, they employ lots and lots of people in this country. They deliver lots of financial benefit back to this country, How do we manage that transition?
Isn't it? And I've been around in this game long enough to remember BP. Roger Harrabin called me a veteran the other day, which was a bit of a shocker. But yeah, I remember when BP first came out in the 90s with its strong sort of beyond petroleum strapline, and I think the jury's out. Actually, I think past performance oil majors in the UK and elsewhere in the world, it doesn't fill you with confidence. But we are at a different point. There is much more consensus around the need for net zero, and it's getting harder to sort of hide away those sorts of lobbying strategies. So I think that the way to handle this is absolutely not to demonise companies, and definitely not to demonise workers and regions. But actually, take it at face value and make sure that there is nowhere to hide in carbon terms. So, for example, I was part of a project at Lancaster looking at the governance of carbon removals, and one obvious thing would be to separate out targets for carbon removal compared to carbon reduction, so that you have to do both, because fudging carbon removal and carbon reduction is really, really unhelpful. So that's just one example. I would say absolutely take them, assume that people in organisations want to be part. There is transparency around lobbying. I mean, there needs to be a lot more transparency about political donations and lobbying. And then lastly, I would say that if you get the governance right, that if you, and I would recommend that Institute for Government report on that, if you have a much clearer and more transparent process by which these policies are developed, then that again helps to manage high carbon interests in the process.
Thank you so much for that. And Chris, I'm not going to ask you exactly the same question, Chris, but building on that, one of the things people talk about the green recovery is that as kind of just transition, fairness, and that shift from sector to sector, and whether it's oil and gas or other sectors, there's this great, if you like, a dream sold about the green recovery, about all the jobs it's going to create, all the training opportunities it's going to create. Is that real? Is it realistic? Can we realistically create enough roles and jobs in the time frame and realistically do that to allow that transition to happen for the youngsters coming out of school today, for the industries that are being shut down today? Or are we misleading people?
Well, I have to say, I do think there is a bit of snake oil about the job story. So, I mean, it's important to say that it's not universally positive. The transition to net zero involves focusing hard on a challenge and accepting that there is a lot of friction in moving to that point. And some of that friction comes from the sectors that we've just talked about, particularly the oil and gas sector. So you can't duck that. But overall, there is indeed a lot of employment that goes with net zero, and one of the things we'll be doing in December is trying to put some new numbers around that. So if I just give you a kind of a little taste of what we'll be seeing on the 9th of December, the overall challenge of getting to net zero is predominantly one of investing. So it involves effectively kind of increasing the amount of capital investment that's done each year across the whole economy, of the order of 50 billion a year extra capital investment. Now that's a big number, but actually as a proportion of the size of the economy is not a big number. That's interesting in and of itself, I think. So that's what buys you net zero. Now with that investment at that kind of scale, there are a lot of jobs. Now you can plan that, you can look at that, you can direct that to those areas where those jobs are really needed. This is the Boris levelling up agenda. It is definitely my hope that that is the basis of Boris's interest in this whole endeavour, because if that money and that capital investment is directed in the right places, then the employment impacts come with it. We'll be able to put some numbers around that in December, so that's going to be an interesting thing to look out for. It follows that if we don't plan it well, if we kind of lurch into this, if we imagine that it's going to happen by magic, sort of osmosis of getting these wonderful job impacts and just getting to net zero, by hope and magic rather than by planning it properly, then you don't get those impacts. So it's not it's not an easy thing to say, you know, that there's a blanket positive thing that comes with net zero. It's got to be carefully managed properly. This is not about having like a state plan for this. It's about saying actually the things that we're going to invest in, like housing retrofits, as Mike talked about, they are labour intensive things. We've got to make sure that the policies drive the money in the right way so that you can build a genuine supply chain around those things. I'll just make one brief comment on that. One of the best things that the government in Westminster has done over the last few months is this Green Homes Grant. But it's equally true that good as it is, it's not going to be in place for long enough to have the effect that we all want it to have, because it's going to run out at the end of this financial year. It's a really good example of a really good policy, badly implemented if we end it in April. So, you know, that's got to be that kind of policy that if it's planned well, if we extend it over time, that you can genuinely build a supply chain around it, then we will have a really positive story to talk about on jobs when it comes to energy efficiency and home retrofit. So it's that kind of thought that I'm looking for, not a kind of state plan for everything, but more that when we plan the policies that kick this off, we think carefully about the jobs impact with it. And if we do that, it's going to be positive.
Brilliant. Look, thank you. And Chris, as always, you got the last word. I think that's fantastic. Maybe very, very appropriate as well. You are the social conscience of us all and the leader of us all in this conversation. Can I just say a massive thanks to Mike, to Chris, to Rebecca. You were brilliant, fantastic, just engaging as ever on the issues you've raised and the challenges and the opportunities. Absolutely amazing. To the over 500 of you watching, I hope you've really, really enjoyed it. I hope, like Chris, you're in your bedroom watching this in the comfort of your home. You're not allowed to go back to bed. There's too much going on in the world today. We've got a US election to see the result of, and you've got the rest of the All Energy Conference. Enjoy it, and thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.